So, when a new piece of software updates on your phone or, your computer, and that massive sprawling terms and conditions document pops up, what do you actually do?
Oh, I mean, I definitely don't read it. I just scroll furiously to the bottom.
Right, exactly. If you're like basically 99% of humanity, you just scroll down, check the I agree box, and get on with your day.
Yeah, because it's intimidating, right? It's
Yeah.
dense, it's legally binding.
It is. It dictates exactly how this powerful system is going to operate in your life. What data it will extract, what rules you're bound by.
But we just treat it as a placeholder.
Yeah.
We assume it's like this safe, standard boilerplate.
Exactly, like a legal lullaby. We don't think it requires our active critical engagement at all. We just stare at the mechanics of our digital reality and nod along.
Because actually engaging with it would mean taking responsibility for the system you're opting into. And nobody wants to do that.
No, definitely not. But here's the question we have to ask today. What happens when humanity takes that exact same psychological shortcut, that identical desire for the safe and the unexamined, and applies it to ancient civilizational blueprints?
Oh, that is a huge question. And it's exactly what we're tackling today.
Right, so welcome to today's deep dive. We are opening the Tului Islam Digital Archives to look at the sources detailing Lecture 1 of 14, which focuses on Surah Ta-Ha.
And, for centuries, this specific text has been treated as exactly what you said, a mystical lullaby.
Yeah, just a collection of magical codes meant to comfort a stressed-out individual.
But the rationalist, razor-sharp perspective of Allama G.A. Parwez argues something completely different.
He argues that we have basically been blindly scrolling past the most rigorous, evidence-based socioeconomic terms and conditions humanity has ever been handed.
I mean, the consequences of that collective blind scrolling are just truly civilizational.
They really are.
When you look at Allama Parwez's analysis of these opening 8 verses of Surah Ta-Ha, what immediately becomes clear is how fiercely he counters that traditional passive framing.
Yeah, he really doesn't hold back.
Not at all. He identifies that historical approach, the tendency to view the text as unknowable divine mysteries or spiritual comfort food. He sees that not as deep piety, but as an intellectual cop-out.
Wow, an intellectual cop-out. That's a strong way to put it.
It is, but it makes sense. It's a defense mechanism.
Ah.
Because by framing the opening of this text as some impenetrable magical code, you effectively mask the highly advanced psychological and social reality that it's demanding.
Right, you basically neutralize the threat of the text.
Exactly, because if it's just magic, well, then it doesn't require you to change your economic systems or your power structures or your societal baseline.
You can just keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah. But Parwez asserts that the text explicitly declares right out of the gate that it did not come to cause internal distress or demand blind compliance.
It came to spark a systemic, rational revolution.
Yes. So our core mission today for this deep dive is to completely strip away centuries of this mystical passivity.
We're going to uncover the dynamic socioeconomic physics that are actually written into the architecture of these words.
I can't wait. Where do we start?
Well, I want to start right at the very beginning of that architecture. Literally the first 2 letters of the chapter, Taha.
Okay, yeah, the letters.
Because if we are completely rejecting the idea that this is a magical spell to be chanted in the dark, or some divine secret human brains can't comprehend, we need a functional explanation.
We do.
But wait, if these letters were originally just ancient abbreviations, as the rationalist view suggests, why did an entire historical tradition of treating them as magical codes develop in the first place? Like, how did we lose the original meaning so completely?
It's a phenomenal question, really, and I think it speaks to the devolution of human societies.
How so?
Well, to understand the original meaning, you have to look at the mechanics of ancient Semitic languages, and specifically the literary environment of 7th century Arabia.
Okay, set the scene for us.
These separated letters, which are known as muqatta'at, were actually a standard, widely recognized convention among the rhetoricians and orators of the time.
Oh, really? So it wasn't some strange alien thing?
Not at all. They are, quite simply, abbreviations. It was a functional, communicative utility.
Like saying RSVP or something.
Exactly like that. In oral and early written traditions, an orator would use abbreviated letters at the beginning of a discourse to just call for attention.
Or maybe to signal a specific recipient?
Right, or to reference a known concept without spelling it out entirely. Parwez points out that Taha essentially translates to "oh man," or O humanity.
Oh, wow. So it's a direct functional address.
Yeah, it's literally the text tapping the microphone, clearing its throat to get the room's attention before delivering a massive civilizational blueprint.
That is so much more practical than a magical chant. But then to my earlier question, how did it degrade into magic?
Well, that happens when a society shifts from being active participants in a system to being passive subjects of an empire.
Ah, I see.
Think about it. Subsequent generations lost the intellectual rigor of the original audience, and later empires found it much easier to rule over a superstitious populace rather than a critically thinking one.
Of course they did. If you're critically thinking, you might question the empire.
Exactly. So the pragmatic, functional tools of the text were mythologized. A society that favors superstition over systemic accountability will always turn a functional blueprint into a magical relic.
So they basically took the equivalent of an RSVP at the bottom of an invitation and turned it into an incantation.
That is exactly what happened.
Okay, so the original audience would have heard Taha not as a spooky mystery, but as a sharp, listen up, humanity.
Right. Pay attention.
And what they're supposed to listen to comes immediately after in verse 2. The text states that it was not sent down to cause a state of tashka.
Yes, Tashka. This is a crucial word.
Now, the traditional translation of this word usually leans heavily into the emotional or spiritual realm, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Like you read commentaries that say, we didn't send this to make you sad, or we didn't send this to overwhelm you with religious rituals.
Which is such a limited view.
But the source material takes this word, tashka, and fundamentally changes the stakes of the entire text. What is the actual root mechanism of this word?
The redefinition of Tashka is arguably the cornerstone of this entire rationalist perspective.
Okay, break it down for us.
Parwez looks at the linguistic roots and the practical usage of Tashka in ancient Arabic. And he reveals that it's not merely about internal spiritual melancholy.
So it's not just feeling sad.
No, it is an intensely physical, tangible state of deprivation. It encompasses physical hardship, grueling labor with no commensurate reward, and systemic starvation.
Wow, so it's very material.
Absolutely. It is the grinding distress of a society where the baseline necessities of life, food, shelter, security, are constantly out of reach for the majority of the population.
Sounds like pure survival mode.
That's exactly it. Tashka is the mathematical result of an unjust economic system.
The sources bring up a really striking analogy here that I think clarifies this perfectly.
Oh, the donkey analogy.
Yeah. They compare a human living in a state of tashka to a beast of burden, specifically a day-laboring donkey.
It's a brutal comparison, but so accurate.
Like, think about the life cycle of a working donkey for a second. Its owner just loads it up with heavy bricks at sunrise.
Yeah, or grain. Just an immense amount of weight.
Exactly. And the animal walks all day just straining and sweating. It exhausts its absolute physical limits. And then, at the end of the day, what is the reward?
It's just a pile of grass, literally just enough raw calories so the animal doesn't die in its sleep.
Right. So it can wake up and haul bricks again tomorrow. It's a completely closed loop of labor and bare minimum survival.
And it never escapes that loop.
Never. And what the text is saying through Parwez's lens is that a human being who works to the bone from sunrise to sunset, completely exhausting their cognitive and physical resources just to secure a meager meal and keep the lights on.
They are living a life of Tashka.
Yes. They have been socioeconomically reduced to the existential status of that donkey.
It is a brutal reflection of reality, but an absolutely necessary one.
It really hits hard when you think about modern society, too.
It does. Because when verse 2 declares, "We have not sent this system down to you so that you remain in a state of Tashka," it is explicitly stating its purpose as a socioeconomic intervention.
It's a declaration of intent to elevate humanity above this pure survival mode existence.
Think about the mechanics of human potential. A human being possesses a cerebral cortex designed for higher pursuits, right?
Right, like intellectual growth, artistic expression.
Exactly. Scientific discovery, exploring the cosmos, developing complex ethical systems. But there is a massive cognitive tax to poverty.
Oh, for sure. You can't focus on art if you're starving.
You literally cannot ponder the mysteries of the universe or build a thriving, innovative civilization if your stomach is empty, or if your entire central nervous system is redlining on the stress of how you're going to feed your children tomorrow.
Your brain is just entirely hijacked by survival.
Yes. You cannot achieve your human potential if you are trapped in the donkey's loop.
So the text is announcing itself not as a spiritual sedative, but as an architectural blueprint.
An architectural blueprint to restructure society so that the grinding, animalistic struggle for basic material survival is permanently eradicated.
So if the explicit goal of the system is to eradicate Tashka, we have to understand how we got into that state of deprivation in the first place.
Right. We have to look at the origin of the problem.
And this is where the sources pivot to the story of Adam. Now, I have to admit, when I first saw this in the notes, I was pretty skeptical.
Oh, I don't blame you. Most people are.
Because the traditional view of Adam is deeply ingrained as a literal historical biography. Like, we are taught about a single man and a single woman in a literal magical orchard.
A literal garden with literal talking animals.
Yeah, they get tricked by a talking snake into eating an enchanted apple. And because of that one dietary mistake, the entire human race is cursed to suffer forever.
Which, when you say it out loud, feels entirely mythological.
It really does. But the rationalist perspective looks at this narrative and argues that taking it literally completely destroys the actual mechanics of the story.
It does destroy it.
So if Adam isn't a historical guy, but a sociological archetype, that means the fall of man wasn't a divine punishment we inherited.
No, not at all.
It's an ongoing economic choice we are actively making right now that changes the entire burden of responsibility.
It shifts the burden entirely from the realm of the divine onto the shoulders of human societal structures.
Which is heavy, but empowering.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
This source fundamentally reframes the parable of Adam. It argues that the word Adam itself is used in the text as a representative term for the human species.
So it's not a dude named Adam.
Right. It specifically represents early human society as a whole. It is a psychological and sociological archetype used to explain human evolution and social organization.
That makes so much more sense.
When you view it through this lens, every single element of the story transforms from magic into sociology.
Let's track that transformation then. If Adam represents early humanity, what does the garden represent?
Ah, the garden.
Because traditionally, Jana, or the garden, is this mystical paradise somewhere up in the clouds, like a place you go after you die if you behave well.
Well, in the rationalist framework, the garden represents an equitable, harmonious societal baseline right here on Earth.
Right here on Earth.
It is a metaphorical description of an early stage of human social evolution. Think of it as a state of nature, where the foundational needs of life were readily available and shared without complex economic barriers.
Or artificial scarcity.
Exactly. It's a society where the baseline is effortlessly met for everyone. And the text is incredibly precise about what constitutes this baseline.
It gives criteria, right?
It explicitly lists 4 criteria when describing the state of the garden. It says essentially that here you will not go hungry, you will not go naked, you will not suffer from thirst, and you will not suffer from the scorching heat.
Notice the complete lack of anything supernatural in that list.
It's very grounded.
It is literally just food, water, clothing, and shelter. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just the very bottom physiological tier. It is basic material security.
Exactly. The garden is not a place of idle magical luxury where grapes peel themselves and fly into your mouth.
Right, it's not a cartoon.
It is a socioeconomic state devoid of Tashka.
Yeah.
It is a state where the anxiety of survival does not exist because resources are accessible to the collective.
And understanding this equitable baseline is crucial for grasping Parwez's analysis of the turning point of the story, right?
The so-called forbidden tree.
Yes, the shajara. In every traditional telling, it's a literal tree with literal fruit.
Which makes no rational sense.
But we are looking at the mechanics of ancient linguistics here. When you look at the Arabic root of the word shajara, it is not just botanical, is it? What is the actual mechanism being described?
The root letters of shajar, shin, jim, shah carry the fundamental meaning of dispute, conflict, or branching off.
Branching off, okay.
To understand why, think about the physical structure of a tree. It starts at the ground as a single unified trunk.
Right, but then it grows.
As it grows, it splits. It divides into major branches, which then split into smaller branches going off in different opposing directions, basically competing for sunlight and space.
Oh, wow. I
Yeah.
see where this is going.
In ancient Arabic linguistics, this visual metaphor was applied directly to human relationships.
So when a unified group of people experiences a schism,
Exactly. When they divide into factions, when they start opposing each other and branching off into self-interest, that societal conflict is referred to using the root of shajara.
So we are talking about the birth of tribalism and artificial scarcity.
Yes, precisely.
The tragic fall of humanity wasn't about someone getting hungry and eating a magical fruit they weren't supposed to touch.
No, not at all.
The text is using a multi-layered metaphor to describe a massive sociological disaster.
It's documenting a shift in human behavior.
Humanity was living in this unified, equitable state, the garden, where the baseline resources of food, water, and shelter were accessible. The warning to early humanity was, do not approach the shajara.
Do not approach this state of branching off into disputes.
Right. Do not divide yourselves into warring factions over these resources.
And the parable illustrates that this is exactly what human society did.
We couldn't help ourselves.
The allegory of eating from the tree is the historical moment humanity fell into socioeconomic conflict. It is the beginning of hoarding.
Oh, hoarding.
It is the moment when one group looks at a river and decides, this water source is exclusively ours, and if you want to drink, you must serve us.
Or when a group looks at fertile land and says, we are putting a fence around this and we will control the output.
Exactly. The unified trunk of early human society splintered into branches of self-interest, tribalism, and economic monopolization.
And the immediate result of approaching this tree of dispute was the loss of the garden. They were expelled.
The inevitable consequence.
Yeah. But again, under this framework, they weren't expelled from a magical cloud. They were expelled from that state of equitable security.
The expulsion is the direct mathematical consequence of resource hoarding and societal division.
It's cause and effect.
Once a society introduces artificial scarcity through greed and division, they inevitably create a class system.
They create a class of hoarders.
And they create a class of people who are deprived. They create the donkey hauling the bricks.
Wow.
The direct result of the shajara, the dispute, is the birth of historical Tashka.
So the human species was cast out of their equitable baseline into a brutal new reality where they now had to face the grinding anxiety of survival, purely because they had broken the equitable system.
That's it. The text uses this parable not to tell a bedtime story, but to explain the historical origin of socioeconomic injustice.
It is actively telling the reader, your deprivation, your poverty, your exhaustion is not a divine curse.
It is the systemic result of human selfishness and division.
But that raises a massive problem. If the text is diagnosing the origin of poverty and framing itself as the cure, how does it actually initiate that cure?
Good question. How do we fix it?
This brings us to the linguistic deep dive in verse 3, where the text refers to itself as a tadkira.
Tadkira, yeah.
Traditionally, this is translated as remembrance or reminder. And honestly, that sounds incredibly passive.
It really does. It sounds very quiet.
The immediate mental image of remembrance is someone sitting quietly in a dimly lit room, completely disconnected from the struggles of the outside world, rolling a rosary through their fingers, just chanting a specific word or phrase over and over again.
Just meditating while the world burns.
Exactly. It implies that the ultimate goal of the text is to just make you think peaceful spiritual thoughts while the societal structures burn down around you. How does the rationalist framework interpret this?
Well, the source material completely dismantles that mythological passive definition.
I figured it would.
Parwez argues that reducing a concept as potent as tadkira to a repetitive vocal chant is a tragic linguistic and conceptual error.
So what does it actually mean?
In its rich root meaning, tadkira is a profound cognitive awakening.
A cognitive awakening.
It implies bringing a vital, life-altering reality to the absolute forefront of your consciousness and keeping it there, not as a mantra, but as an active, guiding operating system.
It is a comprehensive, pragmatic program.
Exactly.
But how does a cognitive awakening actually restructure a society? Like, how do we get from thinking differently to eradicating poverty?
You have to look at what is being awakened. Parwez connects the root of tadkira to the concepts of honor, dignity, and elevated status.
Oh, that's interesting.
A true tadkira is a mechanism that brings a forgotten greatness back to a society's consciousness. Think back to the donkey hauling bricks.
Okay.
If a society's fallen deeply into tashka, if the masses have accepted the life of the burdened beast, if they believe that their poverty is just the way things are, that it's the will of the divine.
Then they have forgotten their fundamental human dignity. They have accepted the artificial scarcity.
Exactly. The text, functioning as a tadkira, is not just reminding them that a higher power exists, it is violently waking them up to their own inherent value.
Wow.
It is reminding them of the equitable baseline they are entitled to and the universal laws they must actively adopt to reclaim that value.
So it is an architectural blueprint designed to pull a fallen society out of the mud and restore them to a position of civilizational honor.
Yes, you do not achieve the restructuring of an economy by sitting in a corner with a rosary. You achieve it by cognitive revolution followed by systemic coordinated action.
It is a manifesto.
It absolutely is.
And speaking of pulling a society out of the mud, we have to look at verse 6, because this is where the text anchors this cognitive revolution into absolute material reality.
Right, verse 6.
The verse mentions that the ultimate authority extends over what is in the heavens, what is on the earth, what is between them, and what is under the soil. The specific Arabic term used is al-Thara. Now, I have to highlight the joke the host in the source material makes here, because it perfectly encapsulates the absurdity of the traditional approach.
Oh, the wet dirt joke. I love this.
It's so good. He points out how traditional commentators will read the phrase under the soil, and because they are operating purely in a literalist, pre-scientific mindset, their minds immediately go to literal wet dirt.
Literally just damp earth.
Yeah. They picture someone digging a shallow hole until they hit moist earth, and they think, ah, yes, the divine authority controls this damp mud.
It's comical.
And in doing so, they entirely, spectacularly miss the massive macroeconomic physics that is actually being laid out.
It is a profound failure of systemic analysis.
And it really is.
Parwez explains that Al-Thara is not a trivial geological observation about damp earth. It represents the deepest material and economic baseline of a civilization.
The actual resources.
Exactly. It refers to the hidden foundational resources of the planet. We talk about mineral wealth, the water tables, the raw materials, the fossil fuels.
The elements that literally power human industry, agriculture, and progress.
Yes. When the text asserts that the ultimate system holds authority over Al-Thara, it is establishing a fundamental macroeconomic principle.
It is establishing that the universal laws outlined in this blueprint are meant to govern the distribution, ownership, and utilization of these foundational economic resources.
Precisely. You have to connect this back to the core objective.
Yeah.
The eradication of tashka.
Right, the eradication of deprivation.
How do you eradicate systemic deprivation? You cannot do it with positive thoughts. You do it by managing the resources of the earth, Al-Thara, equitably.
If a society allows a tiny, powerful faction of its population to monopolize the foundational wealth of the earth.
If they control the water, the minerals, the energy.
While the rest of the population starves or works as day laborers just to survive, that society is violently violating the law of the system.
The mention of Al-Thara is a direct demand for human beings to explore, understand, and justly manage the hidden resources of their planet in order to recreate that equitable garden state.
It grounds the entire text in absolute material reality.
Completely.
This is not about building spiritual castles in the sky. It is about managing the wealth under the soil to feed the people walking on it.
Beautifully put.
So this brings us to a really fascinating psychological tension in the text.
Okay, what kind of tension?
We have established that this is a rational, material, macroeconomic blueprint. But if we go back to verse 3, it says that this tadkira, this awakening program, is specifically for him who fears or stands in awe.
Ah, yes. The Arabic phrase is liman yaksha.
Right. Now, just like with remembrance, the word fear carries an immense amount of historical baggage.
It absolutely does.
The traditional translation of yaksha usually conjures the image of a trembling subject cowering before an unpredictable tyrannical king. It implies an irrational, paralyzing terror.
Which is such a toxic way to view it.
It is. And logically, if the text is a rational blueprint designed to cure poverty and empower humanity, why would it want you to be an unthinking, trembling mess? That is the exact opposite of the cognitive state you need to build a functioning civilization.
And that contradiction is exactly why Parwez emphasizes that the traditional translation is fundamentally flawed.
It has to be.
The entire framework of this text explicitly rejects blind, unthinking dogmatism. It actively rejects the tyranny of unproven assertions. Therefore, yaksha cannot mean irrational terror.
So what does it mean in this rationalist framework?
In the rationalist framework, yaksha is a profound demand for intellectual vulnerability and empirical validation. It is the awe that arises from deep systemic knowledge, not from ignorance.
Can you break down the difference between those two types of awe? Like, what does that look like practically?
Think of the awe a brilliant astrophysicist feels when they look through a telescope at the formation of a galaxy.
Oh, that's a great image.
Or the awe a microbiologist feels when observing the intricate mathematical machinery of a single cell. They are not cowering in terror under their desk.
No, they're fascinated.
They are struck with a profound reverence for the absolute, unyielding mathematical laws of nature. They recognize that these physical laws cannot be bribed, they cannot be sweet-talked, they cannot be ignored.
They demand absolute respect.
Yeah, exactly.
So Yaksha is the realization that the universe does not care about your opinions, your PR campaigns, or your ancestral traditions. It operates on immutable laws.
Yes.
Like if you jump off a 10-story building, gravity does not care if your grandfather thought jumping off buildings was a great idea. Gravity does not care if you chant a really beautiful poem while you fall. You are going to hit the ground.
That is the perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Yaksha is the recognition of those immutable laws of cause and effect, but applied not just to physics, but to sociology and economics.
Okay.
A person or a society that possesses Yaksha is one that looks at the systemic laws of societal collapse and says, if we build our economy on the exploitation of labor, if we monopolize Alfara, our civilization will inevitably face catastrophic internal friction and fall.
So it is a highly rational fear of the consequences of violating universal constants.
Right. It is the absolute rejection of the phrase, we do this because our ancestors did it. It is the demand for evidence-based societal structuring.
But that raises a critical question of measurement.
Measurement. How so?
If this text is not a book of magic spells, but an empirical socioeconomic blueprint, how do we know if we are actually following it?
Oh, I see where you're going.
Historically, human societies have pointed to their massive, ornate temples, the sheer volume of their chanting, the strictness of their clothing, the length of their rituals, and they proudly say, look how pious we are. Look how closely we follow the system.
And Parwez introduces what we call the pragmatic test to completely shatter that illusion of piety.
Tell us about the pragmatic test.
The text challenges human societies with an incredibly straightforward empirical metric. If you claim to have adopted this cognitive awakening, this Tadkira, the proof of your adherence is not in your rituals.
The proof is not in what you claim with your tongue or how many temples you build.
No, the proof is entirely in your socioeconomic reality.
It is the ultimate reality check for civilization.
Exactly. The text stated its core premise in verse 2. It came to remove Tashka deprivation. Therefore, the pragmatic test is brutally simple.
Which is?
Look at your society. Are your people free from the grinding anxiety of survival? Are the basic needs of food, shelter, and security, the baseline of the garden, met for everyone?
Is the wealth of the earth, Althara, managed equitably so that no one is reduced to the status of a burdened donkey?
Right. If the answer is yes, then your society is lining with the universal laws.
And the flip side of that is devastating to so many historical and modern claims of righteousness.
It really is.
If a society's foundation is unjust, if massive wealth inequality exists, if people are starving or working 3 jobs just to avoid homelessness, then that society has utterly failed the pragmatic test.
Failed it completely.
It does not matter how loudly they broadcast their piety on a Friday or a Sunday. It does not matter how beautifully they recite ancient verses. If Tashka exists in their streets, they are inherently mathematically living in opposition to the universal laws.
They are failing the test of reality. The system is broken.
This naturally leads to the next phase of the analysis.
Okay, where do we go from here?
If a society realizes they are failing the pragmatic test, how do they fix the broken system? How do they transition from a state of entrenched Tashka back to the equitable baseline?
Yes, the mechanics of change.
This brings us to the concept of social physics and the law of requital. Let's examine verse 4, which uses a very specific word to describe the transmission of this system. Tanzeel.
Tanzeel, right.
Now, traditionally, when we hear about revelation or the transmission of a divine text, the popular imagination pictures an instantaneous magical flash of light.
A lightning bolt from the sky.
A sort of divine zap, where suddenly a prophet has all the answers and everything is fixed overnight. But the rationalist breakdown of Tanzeel strips away all that magical thinking, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Parwez clarifies that the linguistic root of Tanzeel implies a gradual descent. A step-by-step, methodical, and measured process.
So it's not a zap.
Not at all. This systemic revolution we have been talking about, eradicating entrenched poverty, completely restructuring macroeconomic distribution, and fundamentally changing human psychology from hoarding to equity, it is not and cannot be an overnight magical fix.
In the historical context of the text, the implementation of this program took a rigorous, grueling 23-year period.
23 years. It was a painstaking evolutionary process of lifting humanity from its lowest material state to its highest socio-moral potential.
I think this is a crucial concept for modern listeners to internalize, because we are currently obsessed with the hack.
Oh yeah, we want everything immediately.
We want the 30-day plan to fix our lives, or the single charismatic politician who will fix the country in one election cycle.
But social physics does not work that way.
You cannot rewire a civilization's foundational economics and its deeply entrenched psychology overnight. If you look at history, whenever a group tries to force a magical, instantaneous revolution, usually through sheer violence, it almost always collapses right back into a new form of tyranny.
Every single time.
Why? Because the psychological groundwork hasn't been laid. The Sur and Akfa, the hidden motives, haven't been addressed.
Right. Tanzeelam is the recognition that real, lasting, systemic change requires a rigorous evolutionary timeline.
It requires education, the methodical dismantling of old systems, the gradual building of new ones, and the testing of those systems. It is hard generational work.
It is the fundamental difference between magic and engineering. Magic promises instant results with no effort. Engineering requires time, planning, structural integrity, and strict adherence to physical laws.
That's a brilliant way to put it. Magic versus engineering.
And speaking of the laws of social physics, we arrive at verse 5, which is perhaps one of the most heavily mythologized verses in this entire sequence.
Yes, verse 5.
It states that Al-Rahman, which we will define precisely in a moment, is established on the throne, the Arabic word being arsh.
Okay, I have to push back here on the traditional imagery, because if we are talking about social physics and engineering, the imagery of a king sitting on a literal throne feels wildly out of place.
It really clashes with everything we've just said.
The traditional commentaries get incredibly bogged down in the physical descriptions of this. They debate whether it is a physical chair, how massive it is, whether it is carried by angels, whether it shakes or wobbles when certain cosmic events happen.
It's absurd.
It devolves into this absurd architectural debate about a giant piece of furniture floating in the sky. It feels like a massive regression from the macroeconomic logic we just discussed.
It is a massive regression. It is the ultimate anthropomorphic fallacy, taking a massive, elegant cosmic principle and reducing it to the physical furniture of a human monarch.
So what's the rationalist take?
Parwez explicitly translates this entire phrase, ala arsh istawa, out of the realm of medieval monarchy and strictly into the language of social physics.
How does he translate it?
In classical Arabic literature, the word arsh is frequently used as a metaphor for the seat of ultimate authority and control, the nexus of power. And the word istawa implies perfect balance, equilibrium, and centralized coordination.
So, to use a more modern technological analogy, we aren't talking about a wobbly wooden chair. We are talking about a perfectly calibrated control room.
Exactly. A control room. It represents the perfectly balanced central control system of the universe.
It is the declaration that the universe is not a chaotic, random accident.
Nor is it subject to the unpredictable, emotional whims of a temperamental king who might wake up angry one day and merciful the next.
Right. It is run by an unyielding, predictable, perfectly balanced law of cause and effect.
Parwez refers to this as the law of requital. It is the absolute guarantee that every action in the universe has a corresponding reaction. Every seed planted yields a specific, predictable fruit.
And the text attributes this balanced control room specifically to Al-Rahman.
Ar-Rahman, yes.
Now, traditionally that word is usually just translated as the merciful or the compassionate, but again, mercy is an emotion.
It is, which goes against the physics analogy.
It implies a scenario where a powerful figure has the right to punish you, but arbitrarily chooses not to.
Yeah.
Like, I hope the king is feeling merciful today so he doesn't chop my head off. That doesn't sound like a predictable law of physics.
You're hitting on a crucial linguistic distinction here. The root of Al-Rahman paints a much more systemic picture than simple emotional mercy.
Okay, what does it actually mean?
It refers to the provider of universal nourishment. It is the source that provides exactly what is needed for the growth, development, and sustenance of a thing, and crucially, it provides this unconditionally, without expecting a return or payment.
Unconditional nourishment.
Think about the physical universe. The sun provides immense energy to the earth, driving the water cycle and plant growth. It doesn't send us an energy bill at the end of the month.
That's a great point.
The rain waters the crops. It doesn't ask for a percentage of the harvest.
Therefore, to say that Al-Rahman is established on the Arsh means that the absolute unyielding law governing the central control of the universe is fundamentally calibrated to provide nourishment, evolutionary growth, and equitable sustenance for all things.
Yes, that is the physics of the universe.
Okay, I have to challenge this idea of the law of requital bringing down unjust societies. You were saying the universe acts as a perfectly balanced socioeconomic control room.
It is the claim, yes.
That if a society builds its foundation on injustice, say, an economy based on slave labor, or hoarding, or creating artificial scarcity, the system will naturally course correct and bring them down.
Correct.
But if we look at human history, brutal, exploitative empires have thrived for hundreds of years. The Roman Empire, various colonial empires, modern hyper-capitalist monopolies, they often succeed wildly.
They appear to, yes.
If social physics is real, if this law of requital is a mathematical certainty, why does the math take centuries to catch up to tyrants? Why doesn't the control room shut them down immediately?
That is the most common and most valid pushback against the concept of systemic justice.
Because it just seems like the bad guys win a lot.
It does seem that way.
Yeah.
But the answer lies in understanding the difference between a lightning strike and structural rot.
Okay, explain that.
The law of requital is not karma.
Yeah.
It is not a cosmic vending machine where you put in a bad deed and a piano immediately falls on your head.
Right. It's not magic.
It is structural engineering. When a society builds its macroeconomic foundation, its alfara on exploitation, it is like a construction company building a massive skyscraper using substandard steel and flawed concrete.
Okay. The building might go up.
It might go up. It might look incredibly impressive from the outside. It might stand for decades or even centuries, projecting an image of invincible power and success.
But the structural reality, the physics of the materials cannot be cheated indefinitely.
Exactly. The internal pressures, the societal rot, the microscopic fractures created by wealth inequality, the friction of an oppressed underclass, these forces are constantly compounding.
The structural integrity is compromised from day one.
Yes. The law of requital is the mathematical certainty that the flawed foundation will eventually inevitably fail. The internal contradictions of an unjust system guarantee its own eventual implosion.
It may take generations for the rot to compromise the load-bearing pillars, but when it does, the collapse is absolute.
And here is the brutal truth of the rationalist perspective. No amount of ritualistic chanting, no number of glorious monuments built, no amount of religious posturing will save an unjust civilization from this mathematical certainty.
If your structure defies the laws of balance, it falls. Period.
Period.
That is a terrifying reality, but it is also profoundly empowering. It means history isn't just a random series of tragedies.
It has a mechanism.
It means justice isn't just a nice utopian idea that we should aspire to if we have the time. It is a structural requirement for civilizational survival.
Exactly right.
But that brings up a really tricky aspect of human psychology and politics, because human beings are absolute masters of deception.
Oh, we're the best at it.
We build massive PR campaigns. A tyrannical empire might launch a war of aggression but claim they are spreading democracy.
Or a massive corporation that exploits gig workers and destroys the environment might have beautiful emotional commercials about how much they care about the community.
Yes. How does the law of requital, this systemic social physics, account for the massive gap between what a society says it is doing and what it is actually doing?
That is precisely what verses 7 and 8 address. They reveal the ultimate psychological reality check of this systemic law.
Let's hear it.
Verse 7 states that this system knows the secret. The Arabic word is sir, and what is even more hidden, the word is akfa.
Let's parse the difference between those two mechanisms, sir and akfa. Secret and more hidden. How do they operate in a societal context?
Well, a secret, sir, is something you consciously know, but you are actively and deliberately hiding from others.
You have a clear ulterior motive.
Right. For example, a politician passes a zoning law claiming it is for public safety and community development, but the sir is that they know it will actually line the pockets of their major real estate donors.
They know it is corrupt, but they hide it behind good PR.
Exactly. But akfa, the even more hidden, goes much deeper. It refers to the subconscious, the deeply entrenched psychological drives and structural biases that even the individual of the society might not fully admit to themselves.
Oh, wow. So akfa is the society that fundamentally believes deep down in its structural DNA, that certain classes of people are just meant to be the donkeys hauling the bricks. They
Yes.
don't even say it out loud anymore. They just build their institutions around it and dress it up in the language of meritocracy or the free market.
They don't even realize they're operating on a tyrannical algorithm because it is so deeply embedded in their worldview.
And the text is stating unequivocally, a society cannot fake its intentions to the universe.
Not at all. The systemic laws of cause and effect do not watch your television commercials. They do not read your press releases. They do not react to the beautiful speeches your leaders make.
The law of requital processes the absolute underlying unspoken economic and political realities of a civilization. It processes the Sur and the Akfa.
If your structural reality is exploitative, if your baseline relies on Tashka, the system will process that underlying exploitation and return a mathematically precise result of societal friction and eventual collapse, regardless of how beautifully you masked it.
You cannot hack the law of requital with good marketing,
You really can't.
because the ultimate authority, the central control of the Arsh, possesses what verse 8 calls the most beautiful attributes, Al-Asma, Al-Husna.
And just to be absolutely clear, in the rationalist framework, these beautiful attributes are not just a list of 99 pleasant titles for believers to recite during a meditation session to earn spiritual points.
So they aren't just praise words.
No, they are the absolute objective standards of justice, balance, creativity, and equitable provision. They are the defining operational characteristics of the Arsh, the systemic control.
And crucially, they are the functional standards that human beings are required to emulate and implement on Earth.
Yes, to truly know these attributes is to build a society that physically reflects them.
If the universe operates on equitable, unconditional provision, al-Rahman, then human society must be structured to ensure equitable provision for all its citizens.
It is a demand for systemic emulation, not just passive admiration.
Okay, we have covered an incredible amount of intellectual ground today. Let's take a breath and synthesize the mechanics of what we have discovered.
Let's recap.
We started by taking a sledgehammer to the placeholder myth. We realized that the opening of this text, Taha, is not a magical code, but a sharp, urgent broadcast to humanity.
It's an RSVP for civilization.
It is not a text meant to cause us distress. It is an architectural blueprint meant to cure it. We learned that the Garden of Adam wasn't a magical cloud, but an equitable socioeconomic baseline.
And that humanity fell from it not by eating a literal apple, but by approaching the shajara, the tree of dispute.
Splintering into tribal hoarding factions, this action birthed artificial scarcity and plunged humanity into Tashka, a brutal life of systemic deprivation where humans are reduced to beasts of burden, laboring endlessly just for their daily grass.
And we saw how the text presents itself as a tadkira, a profound cognitive awakening.
Challenging us to reclaim our human dignity by managing the foundational macroeconomic resources of the earth, Althara, equitably.
It demands yaksha not cowering, irrational fear, but the deep, rational awe of universal laws, the kind of awe a scientist feels.
And it challenges every single society with the pragmatic test. If your people are starving, if your people are crippled by the anxiety of survival, your system is false, and your piety is an illusion.
We explored the slow evolutionary engineering of Tanzeelam, realizing that you cannot fix a civilization overnight.
And we analyzed the perfect, unyielding balance of the Arsh, the central control of social physics. We realized that the universe tracks our deepest societal motives, our conscious secrets, our Sur, and our deeply embedded structural biases, our Akfa.
You cannot fake a just society. The law of requital will bring down an unjust structure with mathematical certainty, no matter how long it takes for the rot to set in.
Ayat 1 through 8 have successfully established this cosmic, psychological, and socioeconomic baseline. It is a towering, unyielding framework of rationalism, demanding equitable resource management and the absolute rejection of dogmatic passivity.
It is a breathtaking, rigorous setup. It lays out the theory, the laws of physics, if you will, for a perfect, equitable society. It establishes the rules of the game.
But this raises the most thrilling, inevitable question. Theory is one thing. The laws of physics exist in the abstract, but what happens when this absolute, mathematically pure, systemic law is forced to confront a real-world, deeply entrenched, brutally powerful political tyranny?
Oh man, that is the cliffhanger.
And that is the exact cliffhanger the Tolu-i-Islam source material leaves us on. In Lecture 2 of 14, Allama Parwez moves into Ayat 9 through 17.
I can't wait for the next deep dive.
The camera shifts from the cosmic, macroeconomic baseline to a specific human being walking in the desert. We are going to witness the psychological preparation of Moses as he is chosen, not to perform parlor tricks with a wooden staff, but to walk into the absolute center of global superpower and dismantle the pharaonic economic engine brick by brick.
We're going to see social physics directly collide with a dictator.
You will not want to miss it. But for now, I want to leave you with a thought that brings us right back to where we started.
The terms and conditions.
Exactly. The next time you are faced with a massive, seemingly impenetrable block of text, whether it is the terms and conditions of a software update or the ancient blueprints of human civilization, ask yourself, am I just checking the box to stay comfortable?
Am I just nodding along so I don't have to take responsibility?
Or am I ready to read the code, understand the mechanics, and actually change the reality I am living in? Because the universe, it turns out, is not looking for your passive acceptance. It is demanding your cognitive awakening.